Okay, so our final cycle, and arguably one of the most complicated, um, again, I don't want you to get caught up too much because we're going to go through this again at a later point when it's more relevant to ecological problems. But I just want you guys to have a simple understanding of how nitrogen goes through our biosphere. And you can see that I've actually changed the task a little bit. I'm going to take the sources and sinks out of it because really it's not necessarily that clear about where the sources and sinks are, and it's kind of high level stuff. So we're going to take the sources and sinks out. I just want you to know what the four processes are that we have in our nitrogen cycle, and I'm happy for you to just fill in this table. Or this diagram. I've actually created my own version of this, and I just want you to go through my version. So you can see here I've got atmospheric nitrogen, which is in the form of N2. So we know that nitrogen is like 70% of our atmosphere, so it's everywhere. And we need nitrogen to live. It's part of our DNA, it's part of our proteins, plants, animals, everyone needs nitrogen. Every living thing needs nitrogen, okay? And there's heaps in our atmosphere, like much more than there is water. It's probably one of the most common elements on Earth in terms of gaseous elements. But the thing about nitrogen is that it doesn't like being by itself. It's always got to go in a pair. And this pair is really, really hard to break apart to form with other atoms that make up our proteins. Humans can't do it. Plants can't do it. What we need is we need a special type of bacteria, and there's two different ways that we can actually turn this nitrogen in the air into something that other living things can use. And we know what this term is, and that term is going to be fixation. So I'm just going to write it here, okay? Now, one of the ways that we do it really, really well as human beings is by we know that nitrogen fixation happens in two ways. One, it happens in nitrogen fixing bacteria, which is down here. Okay, and the other way that we can do it is there's actually nitrogen fixing bacteria that live on the roots of something called legumes, which is like soybeans or alfalfa. It's a special type of crop that farmers often plant. Okay, now, the bacteria on the roots of the plant, they're not actually the plant. They're bacteria that live in little kind of, they're called nodules, and they're little kind of lumps on the roots of the plant. And what happens is they fix the nitrogen from the atmosphere in the soil, and then because there's a bit of air in the soil, and then what happens is they feed off the sugars of the legumes, and the legumes use the nitrogen that the bacteria give the legumes. Now, what the bacteria does is they break this bond between my nitrogen, two nitrogen atoms, and they add four hydrogens. So nitrogen doesn't like being by itself. Hydrogen's quite a small atom, so we need four of them to make it stable. So it converts it into something called NH4, and that looks a little bit, if we imagine that nitrogen is blue, okay, and then let's imagine that hydrogen is yellow. So I've got four little hydrogens. Doesn't look as neat as that, but that's essentially what ammonia or NH4 looks like. Now, the everyday word for NH4 is something called, and I just accidentally let it slip there, is ammonium. Okay, now you'll hear farmers talk about ammonium a lot because that's the form of nitrogen that plants or that bacteria in the soil need to turn it into nitrogen that plants can use. So this type of nitrogen in legumes, what farmers do when they plant those legumes is they don't harvest them. What they do is they till them back into the soil, which then creates ammonium that's available in the soil, and it takes the nitrogen out of the air, puts it in the soil in a form that is available to plants. Okay, so that's actually a really good way to create, it's called a green crop or green manure crop, and so that's a really good way to increase the productivity of your soil because often nitrogen is a limiting factor for plant growth. In looking at the other way that we fix nitrogen in our soil, this is another form of fixation. Okay, this again is fixation. Okay, what it does is the nitrogen fixing bacteria turns it into ammonium. This bacteria just lives in the soil, they're microorganisms. Okay, and then for a lot of other plants, plants can't actually use ammonium by itself. What they actually need is something called NO3. So instead of having hydrogens, it's a nitrogen atom. And I'll do this again. This is a nitrogen atom here. Okay, and then I've got 3 oxygen atoms, and I'll even call them little O's. Okay, so again, nitrogen doesn't like being by itself. Oxygen's a little bit bigger than hydrogen, so we only need 3 of those. So again, very simplified. If you've studied chemistry and you know that what I'm saying isn't technically correct, that's okay. It's just a simplified way of explaining it. Okay, so we've got ammonium from our nitrogen fixing bacteria. Then our ammonium then needs to turn into something called a nitrate, and that is NO3. Now this is called nitrification, if I can spell it. Okay, now that nitrification process is really important because once this nitrogen is turned into a nitrate, now it can assimilate, as you can see where I've got assimilation here, it can assimilate into plants. So what happens is those nitrates in the soil get sucked up by the soil, by the roots of the plants. Pretty much any plant, legumes are a special type of plant, so pretty much any other plant, they need nitrates. Okay, those nitrates go and from the soil they turn into proteins and different types of, especially DNA. DNA is a protein, so they form the basis for pretty much any cell, living cell. Okay, then when animals eat those proteins from the plants, okay, they then get transferred the proteins for their DNA. Then when those animals die or when they poop out some of those proteins and some of those nitrates, what happens is they turn into something called detritus. So that means dead. We can write that. Okay. So when they become dead, detritivores, things like bacteria and things like mushrooms and fungi and all that kind of stuff, they actually process those nitrates in the dead cells of, or cells of dead animals and waste of animals. They actually turn those nitrates into ammonium again. And so we kind of have a cycle there. There is one other part. So if that cycle happened, we would run out of nitrogen in our atmosphere because we're just constantly sucking it out of the atmosphere and using it and then turning it into ammonium, and we have a massive amount of ammonium. So as part of a way to feed that nitrogen back into our atmosphere, we have something called denitrifying bacteria. And I've got that in black just up here. Now, denitrifying bacteria is easy to remember about what it does because it causes denitrification. So that denitrification is really important because it turns nitrates at this nitrification stage. It turns those nitrates into atmospheric nitrogen again. So it takes away those oxygens and it turns it into again. Whoops. It turns it into, again, what we have with 2 nitrogen atoms sitting really stably in our atmosphere. So most people think that our atmosphere is mostly oxygen and carbon dioxide. They're wrong. Okay, so oxygen makes up like 10% of our atmosphere. It's not very much at all. Carbon dioxide and methane and a few other things make up the atmosphere in the Earth, but nitrogen is probably the big player in that. So that's how the nitrogen cycle works. The 4 most important things you need to remember are the words fixation, nitrification, denitrification, and assimilation. Those things are really important. Just checking on here, when we're talking about detritivores, and I just want to Scroll this across. Okay, when we're talking about detritivores, this step here, when I'm looking at the change from detritus to ammonium, this change is actually called decomposition. Again, quite easy to remember because in our food chain or in our producers and consumers and decomposers, detritivores are our decomposers. And they're really important because they break down pretty much any waste product with any living thing, and that's the reason why we're not up to our eyeballs in tree trunks. So that is the nitrogen cycle. It seems very complicated, but if you can get your head around the way that the nitrogen can change forms and the way that nitrogen is accessible to different living things at different points, you should have your head wrapped around it. The only other thing that I want you to keep in mind is that, again, like the phosphorus cycle, humans are really good at basically over nitrogening the soil by adding fertilizer. And when we add nitrogen to the soil that doesn't need to be there, that plants can't suck up, what happens is it runs off into water systems again. And when we get too much nitrogen in water systems, we get a similar thing to phosphorus, and that can cause pretty bad things in our waterways, which will be in your assignment.